Well, hello there, and welcome to a very special episode of the Working Mumma podcast. I just want to say thank you so much. This is episode 100. I honestly can't believe it. Actually I get a little bit emotional, I think, thinking about this episode, because just even the journey that I've been on over the last few years, what we've actually done in the meantime. Like, I started this podcast in January 2020, and we all know how 2020 went. So there was a moment there that I remember having a conversation with Megan, who was a guest really early on, about financial topics and that. And we were actually both had podcasts, and I was wondering, like, do I even continue? And so it's just funny the journey that I've been on through this podcast, and it actually does make me a little bit emotional, but I have to say it's been a hell of a lot of fun. So today I just want to go through with you just a little bit of the backstory into the Working Mumma podcast, some of my learnings, and a little bit about, my experiences in podcasting over the last pretty much 3.5 years. So for those that don't know the backstory, I started the podcast when I was 18 months into my motherhood journey, and I had been back at work for about 6 months before I had the idea for a podcast. And it was, I was 8 months back at work. I worked 3 days a week in my corporate gig when I launched it. And so people say, like, why did you start doing a podcast? And it was, I was running a couple of events for Working Mumma. It was still pretty new, very much an idea. And always with Working Mumma, I've wanted to bring particularly women that are working mums together to be able to share experiences and also know that you're not alone, but also get support and learning, because there's so many parts of, like, in our corporate jobs that if you Google or even you look up your learning and development systems, if you have one, I'm pretty sure if you Googled matrescence or mental load, you're not going to get any support. And even returning back into work, there's something like only 20% actually of women returning back in feel confident. There's some amazing stats out there, and I've actually got a guest coming on in a couple of weeks' time from the UK with the Careers After Babies report. The return to work is such a journey, and that's why I wanted to be able to provide a platform to help women in that, particularly focusing on that return to work period, but then also just in the everyday mum life. And I knew that with events, you have to be available at that day, at that time, and that location, and that's not always possible. So for example, if you're a mum in Sydney that wanted to come to one of my events in Melbourne, you weren't able to, unless you flew down and all that, which was just not achievable. So when I was a guest on a podcast, I then discovered the medium, and I will profess that I didn't listen to too many podcasts before that, but I can guarantee you now, every time I get in the car, even for like a 20-minute drive, I will find a podcast and I will listen to it. And often I listen to it in multiple stages just because of the trip. So it's one of those things that I just became hooked. So then through podcasting and learning about podcasting, I listened to podcasts and how to do it. So it's one of those things that it's just been an absolute journey. And through podcasting, my one goal has been about helping and supporting at least one other mother navigate the journey of career and motherhood. So it's pretty much just, I just want to help one other person. If it's just give them the confidence about returning back into work, making sure they don't have that mum guilt or as much mum guilt. So it's one of those things, if just I can help one other person, then I think that I've paid it forward. So when I've received messages from people that have said that the podcast has helped them, they've really enjoyed listening, I have to say, honestly, it makes my day, because I've got no idea who's listening. No idea. Absolutely no idea. I've had numbers on how many people have listened to the podcast. And look, to be honest, I'm not breaking any records. Look, the last couple of months have been good, but definitely not breaking any records. I'm not up there in the top charts or anything. But it doesn't really worry me, because if I'm helping you listening in the podcast, then I'm, that's really good enough for me. So a massive thanks if this is your first time listening to an episode, or if you've listened to a few, maybe 10, 20, or even, only one other one. A massive, massive thanks for sticking with me because I know that I say that I'd bring them out regularly and like weekly, and I haven't always, but I think mum life and work and career and everything else sometimes gets in the way. And I have to say this episode did take a little bit to get to this point, because I was like, oh, I've got 100, and a bit of that imposter syndrome did creep in, and I'm like, no, tonight's the night, and I'm definitely recording it. So, you know, as I said earlier, I taught myself how to podcast by listening to podcasts about podcasting, and particularly like there's a Lyndall Harris, Jenna Kutcher. I pretty much binged and Google searched anything how to do it. I did read a few things. There's courses on how to do it, but I thought, you know what, I'm bootstrapping this, so I can't do it. But I've got an IT degree, and so technology, I'm usually the one that I can plug it in and just see what happens. My husband hates it because I'm always the one that presses lots of buttons, and I'm like, oh, look what this does, and I've got no idea what button I've just pressed, and sometimes I do break things. So he's like, oh my goodness. But at least with podcasting, I was like, right, I'm just going to give this a go, do a bit of searching, research, and then away we go. So I did all that, taught myself what to do, and here we are. We're at episode 100. And I will be honest and say that I was a bit unsure how to recognize 100 episodes, because, you know, 100 is a bit of a milestone. You know, it's a ton in the cricket language, and it's always been seen as that big mountain. But as they say, I need to put one foot in front of the other and just record the episode. I did ask people a few weeks ago around what topics you think I should do, how I should actually celebrate it, the 99, you know, the previous 99 episodes. And so, you know what? Here we are. So I'm going to share with you a little bit about the background, but also then go through some of my learnings. And a number of people have actually asked if I've had a favorite guest. But this is kind of like choosing a favorite child, and I can't do that. And generally when I've been going through the process to, you know, find topics and have guests, I've always tried to, you know, put the question out there, particularly in the Working Mumma community on Instagram. I've asked my members of the Working Mumma Village, also seen what's coming in around the media and the like, and what topics might be of interest. There's also been guests that I'm like, I would love to speak to you. And so I've then sometimes just pitched into them, or so I've really had some, you know, fangirl pinch me moments, and I'll get to that shortly. But there's also been some topics that honestly I had no idea about, but we decided to talk about it. And one particular topic about that this is really relevant to is the topic of matrescence. And just before we started recording this episode, I literally could not say the word. I was like, matrescence. I was just fumbling it, and it was so embarrassing. But I have to say, recording that episode was absolutely amazing. And it was like a light bulb moment, because I hadn't really become that familiar up until that point about matrescence. But I was like, oh my goodness, this is exactly how I'm feeling. And this is just gave so much clarity. And so now whenever I'm talking about sometimes the transition into motherhood, the transition even back into work, and the change of what women experience, particularly when they're going on maternity leave and returning, I'm like, matrescence. And people go, yeah. And other people are like, what are you like? What are you talking about? And then the education parts about matrescence. But what I learned was largely from that one episode. So I have to say, you know, that's those topics that have also come up in the podcast. There's many that I had no idea about, but I've certainly, really enjoyed speaking with those guests. And at different times in my motherhood journey, I've certainly been challenged by a topic, and so then I've sought someone to speak on that particular topic. And there's also some thinking, I'm like, I don't know how this topic's going to go, and it's absolutely blown up and it's done really, really well. So in a way as well, for this podcast, even though I've recorded now 100 episodes, it's also been a little bit of my own personal development platform that I've also shared with you along the way around, you know, such these topics and the like. So I know that I haven't had this, you know, kind of professional development in some shape or form. And some of the people I've been so fortunate to speak with, they charge often a few $100s for coaching and the like, or just their services. But I've been so fortunate to be able to pick their brain for often, 45 minutes up to an hour, talking to them on their topics. So it's just been so valuable. And really, to all the guests that I've had, thank you so much, because I've learned so much from you along the way. Each and every podcaster guest, I can guarantee you, I've learned something from, and I've really enjoyed the conversation. I've always wanted the episodes to be conversation based, and I hope you enjoy that, because I don't like that stop-start part, but it's one of those things that I've really enjoyed the process. I've also had guests on like Georgie Dent that I reverse pitched the podcast episode into. And I have to say, I did get so excited. I messaged my good friends from Mother's Group and I was like, oh my goodness, Georgie Dent said yes. And I was so excited. So at the start of the episode, before we did restart recording, I was like, I'm just fangirling here a bit. And look, if you followed me this week on the socials, you would have seen that Georgie Dent actually put me forward to be on the Today Show, which then happened. So that was, and I got to know her through the podcast. So it's one of those things that, yeah, it certainly comes around in circles, and, just take the opportunity. And so each and every episode has a special memory. I can remember where I've recorded it. Certainly in the start of most of these episodes were recorded in my walk-in robe. We moved house halfway through COVID. So now I've got my own study and my own little podcast area. And I haven't had a bad guest. And as I said, I've met so many people along the way. Another memorable episode, just in terms of the organisation of it, was when I had Emma Lovell on. We hadn't prepared any questions, and she's like, is this still happening? And I'd forgotten a little bit that we were recording that night. I was like, okay, right, we'll just go for it. And we literally chatted for like an hour on personal branding and a whole range of topics relating to being a working mum. And it was really lucky that we're both podcast hosts, so we were able to understand the journey. But it was one of those ones that it still remembers. And one of her parts was about, being a mum is not your whole picture. It's one element of, one piece of the puzzle for your picture. And certainly things like that just really rang true. So there's definitely been quotes from many of the guests that I've reshared on social media, and so many that I could still go back and reshare. But I don't have a VA and I'm very limited on time. So in an ideal world, now out of the 99 episodes, the hardest emotionally to record, edit and release, and I still get probably a bit emotional and teary thinking about it, was Amanda from Bears of Hope regarding pregnancy loss. And I shared my own journey about the hardest decision of my life, about ending a pregnancy due to medical reasons. And it was so hard to actually do this episode, but I held it together. Even editing it was quite emotional. I recorded it about 6 months after pregnancy loss. And I hadn't told a lot of people in my community about what had gone through. So that was why it was quite also challenging to also just come a little bit public out and share it. But I knew that I really wanted to share my story to help at least one other person, and also look at this from a carer's perspective about how you can actually help someone going through pregnancy loss, because I know that's one thing that people don't know what to do. So it was by far, that was the hardest episode that I had to record, but we got there, and yeah, I'm so glad that I was able to get this out there. I get pitched topics with people what they'd like to appear on the show. They really, sometimes some of them are actually really, really funny. One of them recently actually gave in, I think another podcast that they were wanting to pitch on, but then some people just want to sell something and not actually what they're going to get out of it. So certainly if you're listening to this and you're pitching into anyone for anything, think about what the listener's going to get out of it. And that's always what I'm really focused in on is, well, what can that person do? What advice can they give? What can they share? What expertise or experiences? So that's certainly something that I look for when I'm chatting with people, or if they've got an interesting topic, then it helps. So yeah, I'm also getting to the stage where there might be some people coming on that it's a round two. So that's going to be exciting when we actually get to that stage as well. I do edit the episodes to remove the ums, and mostly because I also don't think it sounds great or makes the person I'm interviewing sound like an expert when they start a question of response. And I have had over the time someone doing this for me, but it's also a bit expensive. So now, I'm back to me doing all the editing. So again, a massive thanks for, listening and being on the journey. So that's a little bit of background, just recognize the 100 episodes. So now, what are some of my key takeaways? Number one, it takes a village to be a mum. They say, it takes a village to raise a family. 100% agree. But also it takes a village to be a mum. I know personally I couldn't do, working mama. I couldn't be a mum, a wife, have a career, have a life in between all this if I didn't have a village around me to help me. And certainly my number one biggest supporter is definitely my husband. Even I remember saying I'm actually going to do a podcast. He's like, okay. And, he was there when I bought the microphone, and, he doesn't listen to any of the episodes. He would definitely be probably my harshest critic, but, he's always wanting me to improve and that, but he's there as my biggest supporter. So he's often like, what are you doing tonight? I'm like, I'm doing a podcast, or I'm doing something for Working Mumma. So he's okay, but we also do a lot, I do this also on the couch sometimes, not recording podcasts, but, doing Working Mumma. So I have to say, it definitely takes a village to be a mum. So don't think you need to do this alone. And that's also what Working Mumma is very much about. And also that's also in a little bit more detail going into why I created the Working Mumma Village, the membership through it all of creating that community support and engagement as well. That one of probably the biggest lesson, number 2, is about no journey is ever the same. Everyone has different situations. Every mum is doing their best along the way. One of the questions, I've had a couple of standard questions for every single podcast, and that's been with all the guests I've had on about what's their career journey to date and how would they best describe themselves. How would they best describe themselves is a question that always stumps everyone. And I have to say, there's been no response that has ever been the same. And everyone's career journey has always been so different. And it's interesting how many times that becoming a mum has actually made them to reflect or pivot or even elevate their careers because of becoming a mum. And so I think it's just really important. Like when we, so much on our screens and comparisonitis and things like that, no journey is going to be the same. No journey is the same. Our situations are all different. And so I think that's just a friendly reminder. And I have to say, every guest has been completely different. And so just like, no journey's the same. My third takeaway is that the mental load is so important, and it starts at home. Even when I've had focus topics on the mental load as guests, or it sometimes just often just comes up in the conversation about how to, on a particular topic. And so often it comes back to, say around confidence for women, them wondering if they can do it, that transition back. And look, a big part of it is actually the mental load, and by sharing that mental load at home. I was speaking on a panel with relatively short notice recently, and when I actually said to the audience, which was 85% men, I was like, how are you helping your people in your team or even your wife or partner at home with the mental load? Like, what are you doing for childcare drop-off and pickups? And even one of the dads came back to me the day out, like day 2 of the conference, and he said, thank you so much for talking about the mental load, because he said, I'm actually trying to consciously do more and help my wife. He recognizes the work that she does, and he goes, I also want to be a role model by picking up my kids from childcare and drop them off and the like. So it's certainly a topic that comes up regularly on the podcast, but I think it's really, really important as well. Where are we up to? 4, transition. And certainly as it's come up again repeatedly on the podcast. You'll hear me often talking about it, and that transition about coming from maternity leave and returning back into work. It's not that you go from just one day I'm on mat leave and the next day I'm back at work. Yes, physically there is that, but there's such an emotional transition, and there's matrescence, as I spoke about earlier, that all comes into this. And it's really big, and there's so much that I think that organisations aren't doing enough to support that transition, but also then, as one another, really doing it. And so that's why, again, I've got the Working Mumma Village to help you through that transition, be there to support you, also with tools and resources. And I'm actually going to be, focusing in on and doing a bit more of a short course around this transition to really help you. So if you've got any feedback on that and how I can help you more, love to know. Love to have a chat with you. Number 5, mum guilt is real and certainly doesn't go away. Mum guilt, just like mental load transition, mum guilt often comes up, particularly relating back into confidence and the like. I think just as mums, we learn how to manage it. And that's why I'm always going on and harping on about knowing your why and knowing your values. And I remember chatting with Lisa, it was actually on a masterclass in the Working Mumma Village about your values. But it's so important that I think that I know in my personal experience, I know my why, I know my values, my family values between my husband and I as well. And it certainly helps with sharing the mental load, but also then with mum guilt as well. Number 6, and this has been pretty much my whole philosophy in doing the whole podcast, and that is about never stop learning. That there's always something new that you can learn, or a new skill, or a new, even just awareness of a topic. And never stop learning. And I've, one example of that, as I spoke about earlier, was around matrescence and even just the awareness of that particular topic. So that's one thing here, that there's so many more topics that I've got on my to-do list for this podcast of topics that I would love. I've got a whole heap of people already recorded to actually, for many, many, many more episodes to come. And so, you never stop learning. And as I said, for every guest I've had on, I've learned something about it. I've felt empowered. Something's happened. And even I've had guests on that have led to some other work and the like. So, never stop learning. And that's, I think, just such a good thing to have generally in life. Number 7 is about don't be afraid to ask for help. There's been a times like I'm a member of the One Roof community, and I've put my call out in there and actually said, like, I'm looking for podcast guests. These are the topics that I'm interested in, that I think my audience are going to be around. Who would like to be a guest? And certainly asking for help. I've spoken to people about, the podcast process and even outsourced occasionally getting the editing done. Also talked with other people. So I think also one of the things, even just generally as being a working mum, it's about don't be afraid to ask for help. So if you know that you're struggling, there's so much sometimes I think society puts on us that we have to know all the answers, but instead it's actually a strength to say, look, I don't, can I get some help? And it's okay. It's just like recently I was in an interview and something came up and they're like, well, if you don't know the answer, what are you going to do? I was like, just ask for help. And I was like, okay. And it's just something so simple that even in like interview situations, like we're made to feel that we need to know all the answers, but I don't think we ever do. And just like through this podcast, the more that I've learned, the more that I realize I actually don't know. So that's one of my big tips is don't be afraid to ask for help. My number 8, where are we up to? Is gender equity and gender equality. And I've, consuming in stats at the moment, and Australia is the 4th highest of female graduates in the world, according to the OECD. But we have less female workforce participation, and also we have a really high gender pay gap at 13%. For full-time, and when you're part-time workers, it's over 20%. So even though we have so many female graduates, graduating, our workforce participation's dropping, and generally as well, that can be attributed to, motherhood, but also about the supportive workforce that we have to enable women to be able to have a career and also be a mum. So that's also why, and a key reason why I'm so passionate about doing what I do and talking about working mums, advocating for working mums. In my organisation, in my corporate job, I've got a senior position, but I'm supported to continue doing this work because, it's valuable, and I work in a male-dominated industry and they do actually want to increase female workforce participation. So it's one of those things, the more that we can actually provide those pathways, we can support, encourage, help lift each other up. As I said, I was actually on a panel last week speaking, and I told the audience, because I'm really receptive to that it was a very male-dominated audience, and I said that we all have a role to play. Gender diversity and gender equity is not just a female topic. So if it's just the female, we know all the answers. We know exactly what we need to do. One of the biggest things that we need is the support to be able to make the change. And so gender equality is not just a woman's topic. It's everyone's topic to play. So no matter which way you identify, it's about that we all have a role to play in actually overcoming that. So, call it out and have the confidence. And if you don't think you can call it out, speak to someone that you think that might be able to, or do it in a more subtle way. And there's certainly ways about doing that, of navigating it. So if you're having some challenges, happy to speak to you. But definitely, I was probably at times cautious about, do I speak, on LinkedIn? Do I talk about what I do? But now I'm so glad that I do. And it's actually, even today, someone contacted me about the childcare subsidies, and it was a father, and he's saying, I heard about what you've been speaking about and it's hard to navigate. And I said, look, here's some tips. And so if you've got any questions, let me know. So I was like, well, if I can empower him to help him and his family and, sharing the mental load as I just spoke about, the more the merrier. So we also need to be, like, I'm the one that was horrified about my fee increase. My husband was like, oh, okay. And I'm like, no, this is not good enough. So, of course, me getting on my soapbox, which he knows that I will, because it's a topic that I'm so passionate about. But, gender equality, as I said, we all have a role to play. Now, the last two are relating to one particular topic, and I think this is something not just about the podcast, but also just generally as being a working mum. The first one, so this is number 9, is my key takeaway, is about mindset. I haven't had too many podcast episodes just dedicated to mindset, but I have to say there's an element of mindset and confidence and elements of women believing in themselves. And I think this is a really big topic, just similar to what I was just talking about, is about, yes, I can. And mindset, it can oscillate from feeling amazing one moment to feeling, completely opposite and down in the dumps the other, and questioning yourself. We've talked about, imposter syndrome, confidence, you name it. So it's one of those things. And I have to say, at a personal level, I've recently seen a mindset coach, which is, had a massive impact in me. And I'm really thankful for it. And it made a really big difference. And I've really opened my mind up to it, and certainly by just a mindset change. And she said, I was thinking, it's just me. This is what happens. She's like, no, Karina, no, you've got to believe in yourself and what you do. And I'm now actually taking on opportunities that maybe 6 months ago I may have questioned myself and not gone for it. And certainly the mindset as well, that I remember some people that I've maybe have contacted or pitched into, or even just preparing for the interview, I'm like, can I talk about this topic? Am I good enough to talk about this topic? Or what happens if this person says no? And I've generally had everyone that's come on the podcast. I don't think I've had a decline. I had one decline, but they said they were very, very busy, and this person has a very, very busy role. So, and I completely understand, and her schedule is very unpredictable. So I was like, yep, no dramas. But it's one of those things that mindset, you can be like, oh my goodness. And even the mindset of putting myself out there with some topics, and even having a podcast and talking about it, I'm like, who am I to talk about all this? And that, so I've had my own mindset challenges throughout the journey of this. So this is very, probably oversharing, but know that if you've had some challenges with mindset, you're not alone. I've definitely had imposter syndrome, second guess myself, probably even imposter syndrome a little bit for getting out this 100th episode. I'm like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I've actually got to 100. You may not be aware, but most podcasts actually don't get over 7 episodes. And I think the average podcast actually only has 3 episodes in it. So yes, there are millions of podcasts out there, but they generally don't go beyond, many don't go beyond 7. So I'm very happy that I've actually got to 100. I really wanted to get more than 10. So I've definitely obviously exceeded that and smashed it out of the park. But even when I first started the podcast, contacting people cold when there was actually no podcast, and I'm there going, all right, Blake Woodward, do you want to talk about this? And I remember having to sell it a bit, but then also having some good conversations with people along the way. And the mindset of like, oh, what am I doing? And what am I topic? And how am I going to talk about this? But when I then start speaking with people, they're saying, oh, this is a great idea. And I'm like, oh, okay. So it was a bit of confidence. And the more people that I got speaking to, the more confident I also was about interviewing and overcome some of those fears. And yeah, certainly my mindset has certainly improved relating to podcasting. And yeah, I love the medium now. My last key takeaway, similar to what I was just talking about, is just go for it and definitely don't overthink about it. I've had this, as I said, a couple of times about approaching guests, and certainly in putting out certain episodes, thinking, oh, is anyone actually going to like it? Even you'll notice, particularly early on, I actually didn't do many solo episodes. And so for this was also about building up confidence, thinking, what am I to be able to talk about on this particular topic? What do I know anything? But when I've put out those topics and people have responded and you're like, oh, okay, so something has resonated, so I can do it. And there's so many times, even recently, that's, when I was approached with 10 minutes to go to be on a panel and then got all this great feedback. It's just about going for it. Don't overthink it. I've certainly had this approach, with approaching guests and topics and certainly I think just as life as a working mum, the more we think, oh my goodness, this is too hard. How am I going to do this? By putting one foot in front of the other, it's amazing that you get from Monday to Friday somehow, and that you've, approached, you've been able to do what you've been able to do amazingly in between. I had one of those crazy weeks last week and I got to the Friday, I'm like, oh my goodness, like I've actually had what I thought was going to be a real cray week. It was a really crazy week, but also between my husband and I, we both had some wins and in our respective careers, and we were able to then celebrate at the end of the week, and it was really exciting. So yeah, I could actually overthink that week and think, oh my goodness, can we actually do it? But we just went for it and we did it. So yeah, it's one of those things. Just say yes. And this week, if you've seen I was on the Today Show and I just said yes to being approached, and certainly that's one of my biggest hints and tips for you of just do it and figure it out. Everything's figure outable. But also as a working mum, I know it can feel really overwhelming managing the juggle. But certainly know that's where your village comes in to help and support you in being able to do it. So that's why I always do this podcast to help support, hopefully provide a little bit of inspiration to say, yeah, I can do it. And I remember when someone contacted me saying, I had all this guilt about going back to work, but you helped me reduce some of that guilt. And it's definitely one of those things that really have made my day, made my week and my years in going through this podcast and helping me motivate to stay doing it, to keep producing episodes. So on that note, I just want to say a massive, massive thank you. As I said at the start, if this is your first episode, if this is your 10th or 20th episode, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for the encouragement along the way. If you do get a chance, if you would be able to leave a rating or review, particularly on the Apple platform, or if you are on Spotify, that's fine. Do whatever you need to do. If you can give me a shout out, rating, a review, and also then just share it if you've got a couple of friends that you think that might be interested, even if it's like even with your employer, of saying, look, women returning back into work, of here's some and that. So I'll also be the doors of the Working Mumma Village are going to open next week. So what's the Working Mumma Village? It's a community to help give you the tools, resources to help you navigate life as a working mum, particularly focused in around when you're returning back in after maternity leave, but certainly even just in there's many other topics that you have just in anyway as a general in working mum. So as I said, we've got masterclasses. So when you get, professional development work, there's really nothing around mental load, matrescence and the like. So Working Mumma helps you fill that void, because there's a lot of topics that you need to help you elevate in your career, and these topics help give you the confidence and strength so you can actually thrive in all parts. We've also got the 5-step success path that helps you go from feeling overwhelmed to thriving, and I'm certainly there to support you along the way. So again, a massive, massive thanks for listening. Thank you so much. I've got some great guests lined up that I've already recorded. They're already in the can. I just need to get them out over the next couple of months. And yeah, as always, I'll catch you soon.
Thank you for listening to the Working Mumma podcast. Subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcast catcher. Please also feel free to contact me on any of the Working Mumma social channels. Remember, Mumma is MUMMA, or website www.workingmumma.com.au. I would appreciate you to share this podcast with friends and colleagues, especially those that are parents managing the juggle. And I would really appreciate if you had to take the time out to leave a review of the podcast. Thank you, and see you next time. Have a great week.